Okay, good evening. My name is Evan Weiner. My background is a lot of radio, some TV, some pundit work on Sam Donaldson's TV show, including some on baseball, along with other TV outlets, radio. I wrote for Newsday, op-ed pieces for Newsday between 2001 and 2005, written for magazines, speak on cruise ships, speak to colleges, and a number of other things. And one day, it was either Irv Cross or Triplett said to me, "You ought to do something on our history," after they told us about or told me about our history. And so I put it down and I said, you know what, this is going to work out rather well. And some of the people I'm going to talk about today are Woody Strode, Jackie Robinson, Jesse Owens, Joe Louis, Elgin Baylor, who had the first sit down strike, Bill Russell, the AFL All Stars from 1965, the American Football League All Stars, Muhammad Ali, in breaking the color barrier in the National Football League. In breaking the color barrier in the National Football League, if anybody is a fan of Spartacus, the movie, you might recognize that guy. His name is Woody Strode, and Woody Strode was one of two African American players to desegregate the National Football League in 1946. Daniel Reeves, he was a guy from New York, had a lot of money. He bought the Cleveland Rams football team. And in 1945, he lost about $38,000 and said, I'm out of Cleveland. And he saw gold in Los Angeles. And he told the Associated Press in 1946, I believe it will become the greatest professional football town in the country. They didn't have a football team between, say, 1995 and 2017, so he wasn't much of a seer. But he did move his Cleveland Rams team to Los Angeles. He also thought that Dallas, Texas would be a good fit for him, but he went to LA. It's very complicated as you see Daniel Reeves enter the Canton Pro Football Hall of Fame. NFL owners were against the move. Well, they gave their reasons. Travel costs. It's going to cost an arm and a leg to move a team from even Chicago to Los Angeles. And that was right after, 5 years after Bobby Troop wrote the song Get My Kicks On, or Get Your Kicks on Route 66. So Reeves had an NFL owners meeting and he's threatening to move his team from professional football altogether. You call this a national league, he shouted? Well, you can consider the Cleveland Rams out of pro football. Well, the NFL had its reasons, the other owners. No major league franchise in any sport ever called a West Coast city home before. Air travel, well, it wasn't easy, air travel. Going to Los Angeles was 2,000 long, hard miles away from the nearest NFL city, Chicago. And it would take a while to go from Chicago to Los Angeles, 2,000 miles all along the way on Route 66. There was a strong tradition for college football in Los Angeles, but no tradition at all for pro football. In the 1920s, the Los Angeles Coliseum Commission had banned pro teams from its stadium. So breaking the NFL color barrier was not going to be very easy for Dan Reeves, but he has to do this to get a lease in Los Angeles, and one of the players he wants to sign and will sign is this guy, Kenny Washington, who was supposedly the best football player in the late 1930s outside of the NFL or even the American Football League. There was an American Football League in those days. The 1946 agreement, Los Angeles Rams and Dan Reeves' agreement with the Coliseum Commission. The Cleveland Rams owner, Daniel Reeves, had to hire Negro players in 1946 as part of the agreement to move to the Coliseum, despite other NFL owners' opposition, including that of George Preston Marshall, the Washington owner who was a racist and didn't hide the fact he was a racist. But Reeves hired Kenny Washington and Woody Strode. The NFL had a color barrier between 1934 and 1945. Getting a lease from the Los Angeles Coliseum Commission would change the league, and Marshall was against that. There was a guy by the name of Haley Harding. He used to be an athlete, one-time athlete, but he turned journalist. and he was pushing for the NFL to get into the Coliseum. But it came with strings attached, as Haley Harding explained. He was the Los Angeles Tribune sports editor, seized the opportunity, grabbed the microphone, outlined how the Coliseum was funded by public funds from the United States government, from California, and that stadium could never be used by a segregated team. He explained to the owners, the NFL owners, the Los Angeles Coliseum commissioners, and the public that in Los Angeles and other parts of the West, they didn't see black and white differences the way some of the country did, particularly in the South. Dallas, Jim Crow, where Reeves had an eye on going to Dallas. He noted that blacks had served in World War II, that they had been key to much of the war preparation. Remember, 1946, the war ended on September 6, 1945. And that war preparation had taken place in Los Angeles, that blacks had helped to build and fund the Coliseum, and that it was singularly strange that no NFL team had signed a player like Kenny Washington. And Kenny Washington was signed by the Rams. He and Woody Strode. And they become the first two Negroes in the National Football League since Joe Lilliard suited up for the Chicago Cardinals on December 3rd, 1933. The NFL had denied it had a color barrier, but NFL owners systematically removed Negro players from the league over an 8-year period. Lilliard and the Pittsburgh Pirates player Ray Kemp were the last Negroes on rosters in the NFL in 1933. Stroud and Washington's teammates didn't accept them. There were 31 other players on the Los Angeles Rams, 31 white players, 2 black players, and the twain never met. I have to point out one thing here. One of the first coaches ever in the National Football League was Fritz Pollard with the Akron Pros. He was the co-coach of that team. And there is a Fritz Pollard Society today that recommends African-American assistant coaches to the owners that they need to interview for an open coaching job. And Fritz Pollard was very, very outspoken, said people like George Halas, the Chicago Bears coach and owner, systematically removed Negroes from the National Football League over that 13-year period. Meanwhile, there's a new league that starts out late 1945. Arch Ward, the Chicago Tribune sports editor, who came up with the idea of the Major League Baseball All-Star Game in Chicago in 1933, helped put this league together. It was called the All-America Football League. And I once talked to Paul Brown, who is on the left in that picture with Marion Motley, about 1946, the AAFC, and him running the Cleveland Browns and having 2 Negro players on the team. He said, no big deal to me. If they were white, black, chartreuse, purple, green, they could play football. They were on my team. But Brown had watched for those 2 guys, Bill Willis and Marion Motley. He hired them. And the 2 of them became teammates and lifelong friends. Before Jackie Robinson, it was Bill Willis and Marion Motley, and they endured taunts and racial slurs and dirty play from opponents on the field. And one game, the Cleveland Browns, they are supposed to play the Miami Seahawks in Miami, and the 2 players got death threats. And they didn't go. They didn't go because of the death threats. Paul Brown kept them home. But their teammates welcomed them, and they won all of the AAFC championships between 1946 in 1950, and the team won the NFL championship in 1950 when they skipped into the league. Jackie Robinson. Well, Jackie Robinson, every April, Major League Baseball has a celebration of Jackie Robinson's Day, or the anniversary of him breaking into Major League Baseball. It took a long time. That is Moses Fleetwood Walker. He was a catcher with Toledo. 1884, and he was the last African-American player in big league baseball, and Toledo was part of the American Association, one of 2 major leagues in those days, the other being the National League, which is still in existence, and he was out of the American Association at the end of 1884. There were 2 Americas. Believe it or not, that picture of my wife was taken at the Henry Ford Museum. Now, you would never think the Henry Ford Museum would also be a museum that celebrates Black history, but it does. Colored waiting room, white waiting room, for buses, for trains. And in fact, in New York, as late as 1963 at Penn Station, which is presently underneath Madison Square Garden, there were water fountains that said whites only and black and colored only. Two Americas, colored entrance. And there is Private Joe Louis, who's the boxing champion. We'll get into Joe Louis in a few minutes. Jackie Robinson played Major League Baseball for the Brooklyn Dodgers. It's April 15th, 1947, and Jackie Robinson, age 28, becomes the first African-American player in Major League Baseball since 1884, when he steps onto Ebbets Field in Brooklyn to compete for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Robinson broke the color barrier in the sport that had been segregated for more than 63 years. Walker made his debut in the American Association as one of two major leagues at the time. On May 1st, 1884, he was a catcher for the Toledo Blue Stockings in their game against Louisville against the Eclipse squad. The Chicago White Stockings of the National League, today's Chicago Cubs, they date back to the White Stockings. Anyway, the Chicago White Stockings arrived in Toledo for an August 1883 exhibition game. Cap Anson, Chicago's player manager and one of the biggest stars of the game in the 19th century, was furious upon learning he'd be facing a black player, but they were contracted to play in that game. Money is on the line, and there is Cap Anson. Anson grudgingly put his team on the field to avoid forfeiting a share of the gate receipts, but he swore he would never, ever, ever again play against a black man. Anson was very vocal, both on and off the field, about keeping baseball segregated, to the point that he is considered the father of segregated baseball. Meanwhile, the Walker brothers played in Toledo. Moses Fleetwood Walker played 42 games in 1884. Weldy Walker played a few games as an outfielder, but by the end of the season, their major league careers are over. They don't know it at the time, but their major league careers are over by the fall of 1884. He was number one catcher for Toledo, first Negro player to perform in the major leagues. And there was a gentleman's agreement. And I don't know how many of the students have ever seen the movie A Gentleman's Agreement about Darien, Connecticut. That was done in around 1947. A little different circumstances than this gentleman's agreement, but the gentleman's agreement was that black players like Walker would soon lose their place in baseball. In 1887, major league and minor league team owners adopted a secret gentleman's agreement or an unwritten rule that no contracts would be given to black players. The gentleman's agreement was similar to Jim Crow laws adopted by some American states, which effectively forced black players out of all professional leagues by 1900. And there was an ally. The guy's name was Albert G. Spaulding. If you were a kid in New York in the 1950s or the 1960s, there was a little pink ball that you played with. And we called it affectionately the Spalding, because we had the New York accent. But he was a pitcher with Boston, and he was also a sporting goods store owner, and then he made balls and gloves and manufactured bats and things. He becomes an ally of Anson and helps Anson to make sure that Major League Baseball is segregated. American and National League and the predecessor called the American Association, along with the minor leagues, like the International League, had a color barrier up between 1890 and 1946. Jackie would play in the International League in 1946. There was never any formal decree banning African Americans from organized baseball, but African Americans clearly were not wanted on the field or in the stands. I knew a guy by the name of Felix Anthony, who was a Black Panther, who actually covered games in the 1980s for a Black radio network where I met him. And he was telling me he grew up in Philadelphia. And Connie Mack, owner of the Philadelphia A's, not only would not put a black player on the field, he didn't want blacks in the stands. And back in the 1940s, you would see places like St. Louis, colored section only. In St. Louis, colored section only. Yeah, you're welcome to the games. You're going to sit the section away from everybody else. African Americans ended up in the Negro Leagues or barnstorming in Mexico or Cuba. 1984, I was at the Baseball Hall of Fame inductions. Met a guy by the name of Ray Dandridge going into the Baseball Hall of Fame. He told me playing in Mexico as a black player was the greatest experience he could have. He said he made more money than he would in the United States, and he wasn't hassled. He could eat wherever he wanted, stay wherever he wanted, and it was a great experience for them, unlike black players in the United States. Charlie Grant, 1901, could have broken the color barrier. John McGraw, the manager of the Baltimore Orioles, who would later manage the New York Giants, heard all about Charlie Grant. He has a new team in Baltimore in what would become the American League, and he is going to put Charlie Grant on the field if he can. So, but he says that Charlie Grant, he's a Native American. He was really a light-skinned black player, but he was a Native American. Grant had played for teams in the Chicago area and was invited to work out for McGraw, who was managing the Baltimore Orioles in the newly formed American League. That Baltimore Orioles has nothing to do with this Baltimore Orioles, by the way. They moved to Milwaukee, St. Louis, and no, that Baltimore Orioles moved to New York. I'm sorry about that. The Milwaukee Brewers, St. Louis Browns, that's today's Baltimore Orioles, although the Oriole ownership in 1954 disavowed the St. Louis Browns. But anyway, McGraw said Grant was a Cherokee Indian named Charlie Tokahama. The Chicago White Sox owner Charles Comiskey knew of Grant and delayed the plan, and so there was no integration of baseball in 1901. Rube Foster came up with the Negro Leagues in 1920. He was the owner of an independent all-black team, the Chicago American Giants, founded the Negro National League. And that's the beginning of Negro League baseball. There will be the reopening of a stadium in Paterson, New Jersey that hosted Negro League games this year, and that's in Paterson, New Jersey. They rebuilt it. With greater population bases in the north, it was they were able, or Foster's New League was able to survive. Other Negro leagues would sprout up as part of a large and profitable baseball industry throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And this is where it gets slightly murky, because where do the Negro League teams play? Major League Baseball stadiums. Sam Lacey, who I met in the 1980s, he was from Baltimore. And he was a distinguished gentleman at the time that I met him. And I really, at the time I met him, didn't know much about his history, but I did meet him. And he was a guy who called for the desegregation of baseball in 1936. He began lobbying Washington Senators owner Clark Griffith to consider adding star players from the Negro League, in particular those playing for the Homestead Grays, the team that leased Griffith Stadium for its home games. People like Josh Gibson played for the Homestead Grays. It took a while, but Lacey did get a face-to-face meeting with Griffith on the subject in December 1937. This is Lacey talking. I use that old cliche about Washington being first in war, first in peace, and last in the American League, although Washington did go to the World Series around 1933, somewhere around there. And he could remedy that, but he told me the climate wasn't right. Pointed out there were a lot of Southern ball players in the league, and there would be constant confrontations, and moreover, it would break up the Negro Leagues. He saw the Negro Leagues as a source of revenue. So he's making money off the Negro Leagues, renting Griffith Stadium and concessions and all that. So this is also a business venture for Griffith. Wendell Smith is the guy who is credited with telling Branch Rickey about Jackie Robinson. Smith told Rickey, that Robinson, hey, go look at him. He's the guy you want. Robinson was playing football. Robinson's brother Mac was a Olympian in 1936 and actually staged a protest in Pasadena, California when he came back from the Olympics. He was a street sweeper and he was in his Olympic uniform, and people got upset seeing that he's in the United States team's uniform sweeping up the streets of Pasadena. They sent cops out to try to arrest him. And he said, well, I'm doing my job. That was his protest, but he had to put on the regular clothes of a street sweeper. And that was the end of that. So Jackie had had a brush with Jim Crow in Pasadena, among other places. What Branch Rickey wanted was a strong character to successfully execute the integration of baseball. Ralph Kiner was a New York Mets announcer for a very long time, started in 1962, lasted into the 21st century. And Ralph was kind of a comedian, buffoonish on the air, but he really wasn't. He used to have index cards saying, "Time to make a mistake." He learned that from the comedian Phil Harris, who was his next door neighbor in Palm Springs, California. Phil Harris was on the very popular Jack Benny show back in the 1930s and 40s. In fact, Benny pretty much integrated radio by introducing Rochester as a character on the Jack Benny show. But Ralph said there were a lot of protests around New York, and there was a political movement going on. And I decided after he told me this many years later, I better check out what Ralph said. And here we go. Admit Negroes to Big League Baseball. Protest in the streets. In the streets. Admit Negroes to Big League Baseball. Unions and civil rights groups picketed outside the Yankee Stadium. The Polo Grounds in Ebbets Field in New York City. Comiskey Park in Wrigley Field in Chicago. They gathered more than 1 million signatures on petitions demanding that baseball tear down the color barrier. In 1940, at the New York World's Fair, just a stone's throw from where the Mets play today, the Trade Union Athletic Association held an End Jim Crow in Baseball demonstration. There were communists, there were socialists, there were union workers, there were everyday people at this rally. So, Ralph had tuned me into all of this stuff. And there he is, the Wizard of Oz. No, that's the commissioner of baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who ruled with an iron fist, a former federal judge, when it came to people gambling in the game. But there was no iron fist in desegregating baseball by Landis. The all-powerful commissioner? Well, sort of. The petitions asked fans in New York if they were willing to allow the Yankees, Dodgers, and Giants to sign a black player if he were able to make the team. After a year and a half, they handed over 1.5 million signatures to Landis, lands on his desk. And fans said, yeah, we'll support the black players. Whenever he's asked point blank, including from Paul Robeson, the great opera singer who was an All-American at Rutgers University and went to Columbia Law School and was just a magnificent talent as a human being. He could play football. He was a lawyer. He could sing. And he goes before Landis in 1943, and he says, hey, what gives? And Landis would say, not my job, not my decision. World War II, again, Ralph Kiner pointing this out to me. 1941 and 45, more than 1 million Black Americans served their country in World War II. While their military units were segregated, some play on integrated baseball teams while overseas. This ad floated around New York City. It was for a council race. The ad, Good Enough to Die, a black soldier dead during World War II, but not good enough to pitch. Running for re-election to the New York City Council in 1945, Ben Davis, an African-American college football star and a communist, distributed a leaflet with 2 photos of blacks, a dead soldier and a baseball player. Good enough to die for his country, but not good enough to pitch. And there is Ben Davis, his story in the 1950s during the Red Scare. He ends up in jail because he's a communist during the McCarthy era, where everybody was looking for a communist under every rock. Kiner again talking about the push. The New York State Legislature passed the Quinn Ives Act, which banned discrimination in hiring and soon formed a committee to investigate discriminatory hiring practices, including one focused on baseball. And there is Ralph, Kiner's Corner. This is what Ralph told me. It was just another part of the changeover of baseball. It had to happen sooner or later. It was really an aftermath of World War II, where the black players, or Negroes, fought for our side. They had to be recognized. There was a movement at the time. They were going to bring black players into the game. Rickey, Branch Rickey, who Kiner hated. He was his general manager in Pittsburgh, and Ralph led the major leagues in home runs for 8 straight years, wanted a raise, and Rickey said, there were only 8 teams in the league. We finished 8th with you. We could finish 8th without you. You're not getting a raise. Anyway, Rickey was the man who picked Robinson, and that was a brilliant choice. In 1997, I got a chance to do a lengthy interview with Larry Doby. It was the 50th anniversary of him becoming the second African American to play Major League Baseball in the 20th century. So this is Larry Doby. This is not me. This is Doby. Mr. Rickey, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Veeck gave me an opportunity to be in the American League. So I have to say that if Jackie had not made it, I probably would not have been given the opportunity. When you talk about what goes on through your mind 50 years ago, you have to first think of Mr. Rickey, who had the courage to do it. And you think about Mr. Robinson, who had the courage to do it. And you think about Mr. Veeck, who had the courage to do it. Bill Veeck was the owner of the Cleveland Indians. Doby breaks in with the Cleveland Indians in 1947. And me, who had the opportunity to do it. And there is Bill Veeck, and there is a very young Larry Doby. A lot of people ask me, Jack gets a lot of headlines, and you don't get too much headlines. Both Robinson and Doby were in the same boat. They both were verbally abused. They had to live a separate life on the road from their teammates, almost always in hotels in the poorer side of town in certain cities. When a guy is first, he should get the headlines. I know myself, my friends know I was involved in the same type of thing he was involved in. Jackie and Larry. I'm not going to go around asking for publicity, politicking for publicity, but I know what I've done. And I know I have helped some people to accomplish what they've done in terms of coming into the American League. And it makes you feel good being part of it. And that's one thing nobody can take away from me. And and one of the other things, and I think he felt the same way, why stir up things? It's tough enough going through the summer, going through what you are going to go through. You don't want to go through to talk about the same thing during the winter. Let's talk about something positive. Let's be comfortable. Let's be happy. It's a guy by the name of Wally Triplett. I don't know how many of you know who Wally Triplett is. And by the way, if you have any questions, you could throw them into the text and we'll try to get around to it. If I was live, we'd be going back and forth. But anyway, Wally Triplett, defensive back in high school, recruited by the University of Miami around, let's say, 1944. Those days, they read about your what you did in newspapers, clippings, and the University of Miami offered them a scholarship, sight unseen. And Wally wrote back, I don't know if this is a good thing for you or not, but I'm a Negro, but I'm willing to come. And they wrote back a letter, thank you, we're rescinding the scholarship offer, good luck in the future. The Triplett family. Wally Triplett was a chauffeur, confident, card-playing buddy of Jackie Robinson, made sure Jackie always got a home-cooked meal when Robinson played in Philadelphia, when Brooklyn played the Phillies. Philadelphia may have been the toughest place in all of baseball for Robinson, but Wally Triplett and his family made it a lot easier for Jackie and provided an oasis away from the pressures that Robinson was facing. I met Wally Triplett. He sent me an email one day, liked my stuff, and we became very friendly until he got into his 90s and would pass away. He would tell me all kinds of stories back from the day when he was in the NFL. Wally Triplett now is talking. Philadelphia was the worst team in the league for taunting. said Triplett, who in his own right was a sports pioneer by being one of the first Negro players ever to play college football on a field in Texas, as a member of the Penn State football team that went on to the Cotton Bowl. Triplett was Penn State's first Negro player. Philadelphia is where they threw the black cat on the field. Ben Chapman gave Jackie Robinson a really hard time, calling him all kinds of names from the Phillies dugout. If you look at that picture, the photographers, the newspaper photographers, wanted Jackie to shake hands with Ben Chapman. Jackie refused, so somebody gave them a bat, and Jackie put his hand on the bat, and Chapman put his hand on the bat, and that's how that picture came about. But Chapman, in his defense, or his own defense, said, hey, we used to call Joe DiMaggio all kinds of names, his Italian heritage, and we used to call Hank Greenberg all kinds of names, his Jewish heritage. What was the difference? I don't see that I did anything wrong. But when Jackie and the Dodgers played the Phillies, Chapman spewed insults to Robinson from the dugout, ordered his pitchers to bean the rookie on 3-0 counts rather than walking him. And Chapman's antics caused many in baseball to sympathize with Robinson. Robinson had just come from Pittsburgh, and there was a collision with Hank Greenberg at first base. Robinson and Greenberg hit each other. They were both down. Forbes Field crowd, there was a hush in the crowd because they expected Hank to go after him. Instead, they both dusted each other off. Hank patted him on the back and said, don't let those bastards get to you. I went through the same thing in the 1930s, being Jewish on Detroit. There's a in front of the stadium that the Brooklyn Cyclones use in Coney Island. And it allegedly happened, but it probably didn't happen, where Pee Wee Reese, the Dodgers captain, after a tough day, allegedly in Cincinnati, put his arm around Jackie Robinson. Whether it happened or not, nobody knows, because neither man talked about it. But Robinson did say that the Chapman-led racism actually helped bring the Dodger team closer together. The Dodgers went 94-60. Robinson won the Rookie of the Year, and the team reached the World Series, losing to the Yankees. Now, baseball historians have a lot of problems with this story. And they told me that, how could you trust Wally Triplett for telling you this story? Wally Triplett has a very odd take on 1947 and Jackie breaking in 1947. Joe Tepsick. Joe Tepsick befriended Wally Triplett while they were at Penn State. They were football players. Tepsick would sign a contract with Brooklyn that had a clause that he could not be sent to the minor leagues. In 1946, Tepsick was a struggling player with Brooklyn, while Robinson was with the Dodgers AAA farm team in Montreal. And historians have a lot of problems with this story with Wally Triplett. And my thing is, well, Wally drove Jackie around. And he was roommates with Triplett in football at Penn State, playing football at Penn State. This is Wally again. Jackie signed October 23rd, 1945, was sent to Montreal. I was at Penn State, met Tepsick. Tepsick and I became close friends. 1946, Brooklyn Dodger manager Leo DeRocher wanted Jackie and asked Tepsick to go down to Montreal. Tepsick said no. Tepsick had signed a contract with Brooklyn, had a clause in his contract. He could decline going to the minor leagues. He delayed Jackie until 1947. He would not go down. And there is Jackie in 1946. Now, according to accounts available from 1946, Tepsick's teammates were hoping he would accept the demotion and that the team would pick up a veteran pinch hitter. There was no indication, or is no indication, that Brooklyn would have added Robinson. But Triplett said Dodgers manager Leo DeRocher wanted Jackie. Jackie signs in 1945. Jackie made his major league debut on April 15th and became friendly with Triplett soon afterwards. While he had been around baseball as a kid, his father worked for Ed Bolden's Philadelphia Stars Negro League team. He knew Satchel Paige and others through his father. Struck up a conversation with Robinson after a game and took him home. He did the same for Major League Baseball's second Negro player, Larry Doby later on in the 1947 season. Philadelphia had two major league teams, the National League's Phillies and the American League's A's. Connie Mack, the owner and manager of the A's, wasn't too keen on allowing Negroes into a stadium to watch the A's. There is Jackie. Took Jackie home. Let's kill some time, Triplett said of his role as Jackie's driver and friend. My mother cooked him special rolls in greens for him. My mother fell in love with him. He was a nice guy. Branch Rickey selected Jackie because he knew he could withstand the guff. He's a nice person. We used to play pinochle all night. Then I would drive him back to the hotel. He always got a meal from my mother. Well, why Jackie? Why not Doby? Why not Satchel Paige? Triplett has an interesting insight into baseball history. He understood why Robinson, not Doby or Satchel Paige, was the first Negro player in Major League Baseball since the 1880s. Jackie was a good diplomat. Larry Doby always thought he should have been the first, but Doby was not as bubbly a personality as Satch and was more matter-of-fact in personality than Jackie. Doby told me he didn't like Satch, didn't like his antics. So maybe what Wally was telling me was true, that Doby, because of his personality, didn't make it as number two, and Satch, because he was kind of a sideshow, would sign with Cleveland and Bill Veeck eventually, but he couldn't be number one either, even though Bob Feller once told me, the great Cleveland pitcher, Hall of Fame pitcher, who never thought anybody was his equal except for Satch, possibly because Satch taught him how to make some money. After baseball, Jackie Robinson does not get a job in baseball. 1956, Robinson became an executive with the Chock full of Nuts restaurant chain and an advocate for integrating corporate America. Lent his name and prestige to several business ventures, including a construction company and a black-owned bank in Harlem. He never got a baseball job offer. Walter O'Malley, the Dodgers owner, hated him, wanted to get rid of him, and he would. He traded him to the New York Giants for a pitcher by the name of Littlefield. But Robinson had decided to retire before O'Malley traded him. And there is Wally Triplett, Negroes Finally Listed, which was his email at AOL. And he broke into the NFL in 1949, first drafted player ever, African-American player ever, to make an NFL roster. He was one of two Negro Penn State players who desegregated Dallas's Cotton Bowl in 1948. Dennis Hoggard was the other. 1947, the Cotton Bowl in Dallas wanted Penn State to play SMU in the January 1st, 1948 game, but they didn't want Wally Triplett to play. Penn State players said, "We are Penn State." Triplett played, and there is Wally in the Cotton Bowl. Penn State players said, "We are Penn State," and the Negro players are part of the team. Penn State's opponent, Southern Methodist University, came up with a suggestion. Stay at the Dallas Naval Station. Penn State accepted. Practiced at the military installation and played the game. You probably have never heard of this guy. His name is Ernest Jackney. He was an International Olympic Committee delegate. And I give a talk on the 1936 Olympics. And one of the things that I could sell for the 1936 Olympics is I work with Marty Glickman, who is a broadcaster, invented national basketball play-by-play on radio back in 1946 with the New York Knicks. And I worked with him when he had his broadcast school in the late 1980s. I knew Sam Stoller. He ran the Milrose Games. And I interviewed Gretel Bergman, who is the best athlete, female athlete in Europe, a German who could not compete in the 1936 Olympics. Ernest Jackie was a high-ranking official in the Republican chain of events in the 1920s. He was an assistant secretary of the Navy. Jackie was an American International Olympic Committee delegate, and he expressed outrage with reports of what was happening within Hitler's Germany. And on November 25th, 1935, he sends a letter to the IOC president, Count Henri Bellet-Latour, floating the initial idea of an American boycott of the 1936 Berlin Summer Olympics. Neither Americans nor the representatives of other countries can take part in the games in Nazi Germany without at least acquiescing in their contempt of Nazis for fair play and their sordid exploitation of the games. The letter seemed to go unanswered. Janke was a former assistant secretary for the United States Navy and of German descent. He was thrown out of the exclusive club known as the International Olympic Committee by July 1936, and his spot was taken by well-known anti-Semite and racist Avery Brundage. On December 8, 1935, Jeremiah Mahoney called for a boycott of the 1936 Olympics. Mahoney's concern as the head of the AAU. In April 1933, an Aryan-only policy was instituted in all German athletic associations. Non-Aryans, Jews, or individuals with Jewish parents or Romers, Gypsies, were systematically excluded from German sports facilities and associations. This is Mahoney, who is honored at the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. He has a plaque. There's no room for discrimination on the grounds of race, color, or creed in the Olympics. The AAU, and he's the head of the AAU, voted in 1933 to accept an invitation to compete at Berlin in 1936, provided Germany pledged that there would be no discrimination against Jewish athletes. If that pledge is not kept, I personally do not see why we should compete. Ben Johnson, who is a runner from Alabama, said, hold it. We got a problem here in the South. Mahoney was responsible for the selection of the Olympic team. But Johnson said the Negro in the South is discriminated against as much as the Jews in Germany, and he was probably right at that point. It is futile and hypocritical that Judge Mahoney should attempt to clean up conditions in Germany before cleaning up similar conditions in America. Franklin Roosevelt didn't get involved. He urged the American team to go to the Berlin Games. Marty Glickman said, yes, we should go. Because I'm going to win that gold medal. After all, I'm the fastest kid in Brooklyn, which he was, 18 years old in 1936. And he said he was going to win that gold medal in the 4x100 meter relay, get on the podium and shove that medal into the Fuhrer's face, Adolf Hitler. He never did. He was replaced by this guy, Jesse Owens. Nazi Germany used the 1936 Olympic Games for propaganda purposes. The Nazis promoted an image of a new, strong, united Germany while masking Germany's growing militarism. And there's Marty Glickman on the left, Sam Stoller on the right. Sam's 21, Marty's 18. The day before the event, the 4x100 meter relay, they were replaced by Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalfe, the team's two fastest sprinters. Coaches claimed they needed the fastest runners to win the race. Glickman said that, and if you ever talked to Marty and said, hello, how are you? He'd say, may that Avery Brundage rot in hell. Glickman said that Coach Dean Cromwell and Avery Brundage were motivated by anti-Semitism and the desire to spare the Fuhrer the embarrassment and the embarrassing sight of two American Jews on the winning podium. Stoller didn't believe anti-Semitism was involved, but the 21-year-old described the incident in his diary as the most humiliating episode in his life. We were shocked. This is Marty again. Sam was completely stunned. Didn't say a word in the meeting. I was a brash 18-year-old kid. I said, Coach, you can't hide world-class sprinters. At which point Jesse spoke up and said, Coach, I've won my 3 gold medals, the 100, 200, long jump. Tired. I've had it. Let Marty and Sam run. They deserve it, said Jesse. Cromwell pointed his finger at him and said, you'll do as you're told. And in those days, black athletes did as they were told. Jesse was quiet after that. Draper, Wolkoff, stay. There is Jesse, Ralph Metcalfe. August 3rd, 1936, Jesse Owens won the first of 4 gold medals in the following categories: the 100 meter, 200 meter, the long jump, and the 400 by 100 meter relay. He was the most successful athlete at the Berlin Summer Olympic Games, and as a black man, he dispelled Adolf Hitler's idea of Aryan supremacy, which was blonde hair and perfect physiques, coming from a guy who had brown hair and a mustache and who looked out of shape. But that's history. Owens is snubbed by Franklin Roosevelt. Hitler didn't snub me. It was Roosevelt who snubbed me. The president didn't even send a telegram. Roosevelt never publicly acknowledged Owen's triumphs, one of the triumphs, or the triumphs of any of the 18 African Americans who competed at the Berlin Olympics. Only white Olympians were invited to the White House in 1936. Relatives of Jesse Owens and 17 other African Americans who competed at the 1936 Olympics were welcomed to the White House by President Barack Obama in 2016 in the celebration of their lives and accomplishments. Why the snub? Roosevelt probably didn't want to upset members of his own party. After all, he's running for re-election. Southern Democrats who enacted Jim Crow laws after the Civil War. Except those people in the South accepted this guy, Joe Louis. Louis held the World Heavyweight Championship title for 12 years, 24 bouts, longer than any before or since. When the United States entered World War II, Louis enlisted in the Army, and he said, "Might be a lot wrong with America, but nothing Hitler can fix." He fought exhibition matches to raise money for the armed services, boost morale for the troops. He made donations to Military Relief Fund. The historian Jeffrey Sammons says Joe Louis set a stunning example through his acts of patriotism, and even the South responded appreciatively. Well, remember, blacks were told, shut up and do as we say? He didn't. Elgin Baylor, Hall of Fame basketball player, one of the great players of the NBA of his time, and with the proper training methods of today, probably would be one of the great players of today. On January 16th, 1959, Elgin Baylor refused to play a neutral site game for the Lakers against the Cincinnati Royals in segregated Charleston, West Virginia. Baylor and his black teammates could not stay at the all-white hotel with the rest of the team. There's the newspaper headline, hotel snubs, Baylor, he refuses to play, Lakers lose to Cincinnati. I love basketball. I like playing in the league very much, but not at the expense of my dignity. And there is the Lakers owner, Bob Short, and Elgin Baylor. And Baylor, throughout his NBA career, very quietly let people know that he was upset, including in 1964, when the NBA players were looking for a collective bargaining agreement deal, and they were playing an all-star game in Boston. And Elgin Baylor said, I'm not playing without a deal. And the Lakers ownership in the NBA said, well, we're going to bar you from the league. And he said, I dare you. Bob Short and the NBA president at that time, Maurice Podoloff, were irate. Podoloff publicly sided with Baylor, and the league ultimately made the rule that teams would not play in segregated states unless the teams were guaranteed shared accommodations for all players at the white hotels. Walter Beach was signed with the Boston Patriots in the American Football League in 1960. Made the team, and in 61 comes back for a second season. But he tells Billy Sullivan and the Boston Patriots ownership and management, we're going to New Orleans. Part of this team, right? No segregated stuff. I'm not going on the other side, and my black teammates aren't going to the other side of town in New Orleans to stay. We're one team. I'm staying with the team. I'm eating at the same restaurants. That didn't go over too well with Billy Sullivan and the Patriots brass. He was cut by the Patriots in 1961, labeled a troublemaker for organizing a protest among the black players against segregated living conditions during the team's road trip to New Orleans for an exhibition game. The AFL took the money and was also testing out the market to see if it would be a good football market. A couple months after Walter Beach, Bill Russell and the Lexington boycott 1961. I understand Netflix is doing a series of specials on Bill Russell, the great Boston Celtics player. While in Lexington, Kentucky, before the 61-62 season for an exhibition game, Bill Russell and other black members of the Boston Celtics were refused service at a restaurant. They boycotted the game. Blacks were still expected not to complain publicly about discrimination, although Elgin Baylor did a couple of years earlier. Bill Russell and Casey Jones took Satch Sanders and Sam Jones. Want to start a basketball team? Beat LeBron James and Michael Jordan? Put together Russell, Casey Jones, Satch Sanders, Sam Jones with modern training facilities, not working in the off season, they would do rather well against those guys. Anyway, to see Celtics head coach Red Auerbach, Russell told Red we're leaving. So that was because it was important to me that everybody everywhere knows that the black players are deciding they'll stand up for themselves. The Lexington boycott against St. Louis. Sam Jones and Satch Sanders were refused service in a coffee shop at their team hotel in Lexington. We got downstairs to eat and they said, well, we really can't serve you people, Sanders said just 5 years ago. The fifth player for the Celtics, rookie Al Butler, left with them, and two black players for the Hawks joined the boycott. One of those St. Louis players was Cleo Hill, first-round draft pick earlier that year, who was denied service in Lexington. Russell had clout. Hill didn't. And Cleo Hill, number 24, is there on the right side. And his future coach, Bob Pettit, number 9, is there on the left side. I say future coach because here's what happened. During the 1961-62 season, St. Louis Hawks coach Paul Seymour was told by team management to severely diminish Hill's offensive roles so that the stars Bob Pettit, Cliff Hagan, and Clyde Levelette, all white, would receive more shot attempts. Seymour refused, fired, replaced by Fuzzy Levan, who ended up being a Knicks scout for a long time. And then Pettit and Hill's scoring average, and then Pettit, who became coach, and Hill's scoring average dropped from 10.8 a game to 5.5. Never played in the NBA after that season. He later said that he didn't think race played a part in ending his career. Kind of interesting, I suppose. The American Football League. That's Freddie the Hammer Williamson with the Black Raiders jersey or shirt on the top left. Next to Jim Otto, the blonde-haired guy is Clement Daniels. Al Davis, the coach, rookie coach of the Oakland Raiders in 1963, and Art Powell on the right side, the wide receiver. It is August 1963. It is Mobile, Alabama. And 6 African-American members of the Oakland Raiders refused to play in an exhibition game against the New York Jets at Ladd Stadium, which had segregated seating. And Al Davis, the rookie head coach of the Oakland Raiders, is faced with his first crisis as coach. Mobile hosted 3 prior American Football League preseason games in 1960, 61, 62. And there's AD, who went to Adelphia University on Long Island, the rookie coach. Clem Daniels, Art Powell, Bo Robertson, Fred Williamson, Proverb Jones, and Eugene White said, no, we're not playing. Backed by Al Davis. The whole team's not going to Mobile. They're playing the game in Oakland. Now, talk about condescending. Ray Schuessler Jr., Ladd Stadium manager, 1963. The game was supposed to be played at Ladd Stadium in Mobile. We don't want 4 boys from Oakland telling us how to run our stadium. We're going to integrate quietly. Now, we're going to go ahead as in the past for other exhibition games here. Clem Daniels, is a pretty good player for Oakland, said, okay, let's see what the chat said. Davis would eventually own the team. Yes, he would. Eventually, but that's later on. Clement Daniels said, I want to play in Mobile before an integrated crowd and contribute in a small way to breaking down of these needless prejudices. Game is played in Oakland. The AFL never returned to Mobile. The 1965 Senior Bowl was in Mobile, about 7 months after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law on July 7th, 1964. It was integrated, although the organizers reluctantly integrated. Cookie Gilchrist was a star running back in the American Football League, and he ended up in the Canadian Football League for various reasons, which I'm not going to go into now, but you can read why he was not in Cleveland, why he ended up in the CFL, and how he ended up in the American Football League. Cookie Gilchrist did not like how he was treated in New Orleans in January 1965, when the American Football League decided to hold the game, the All-Star game in New Orleans. American Football League at the time was the only league to truly embrace African-American athletes as an equal on the field with the white players. That is Butch Bird on the right, Earl Faison with a fedora, in between Curtis McClinton and I'm not sure who that player is, bending down. And they're at an airport in New Orleans. The reason? They're going home. They're not going to play. New Orleans, why New Orleans for the AFL? Well, New Orleans leader said the city was going to welcome the AFL All-Stars, 22 black players, with open arms. Segregation, Jim Crow, they're just ending. And the city desperately wanted a professional team. And as you can see from this program, from the second annual AFL All-Star game, forget Hank Stram, Henry Stram, and Pop Ivy, the coaches, but there were 8 players, 1 player per each team. Charlie Hennigan, white Houston, Len Dawson, white Dallas, Jim Gilclore, white Boston, Bud McFadden, white Denver, Cookie Gilchrist, black Buffalo, Larry Grantham, white Jets, Freddie the Hammer Williamson, black Oakland, and Earl Faison, black San Diego. 3 of the 8 players featured on the program are black, 37.5% of the program. NFL scouts went to watch players from big-time schools and conferences. AFL looked for players with a different background from black schools, such as Grambling, Bethune-Cookman, Prairie View. Ironically, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 destroyed the black college football programs as the best players could attend the big schools. And the players would be welcomed with open arms, like Ernie the Big Cat Ladd, number 77, with the San Diego Chargers. Ernie has a story. So did others. The players' experience at the New Orleans airport was the first bad sign. Cab after cab passed Clement Daniels, even as the white players zoomed off without having to wait. When a black player went to hop in a cab with a white teammate, the cabbie said no can do, except in Cookie Gilchrist's place. Because Jack Kemp, the Buffalo quarterback, was also the president of the American Football League Players Association and told the cab driver, and Jack was about 29 at the time, and Cookie must have been about 31. I'm responsible. Any action he takes, I'll be responsible for it. You imagine a 29-year-old guy saying, I'm going to be responsible for this guy who's 31 years old? The black players, when they did get to town, I'll get to that in a minute, were denied access at some of the restaurants and nightclubs in the French Quarter. Ernie Ladd is walking down the street, Bourbon Street, with Earl Faison and Dick Westmoreland and a couple other guys, and they pass the Playboy Club. And they hear James Brown blasting out of the speakers, and they decide to go in, and the bouncer there says, I wouldn't go in there if I were you. And Ladd pulls the door off the hinges, goes in, and the guy follows him. The bouncer is about 5'8", 5'9", and pulls a gun on them. They all scamper. They would get cabs. Players called Jack Kemp, said, we're not getting cabs. Jack Kemp called Bud Adams, the owner of the Houston Oilers and one of the co-founders of the American Football League, called the governor of Louisiana, the mayor of New Orleans, and said, hey, what gives here? We're supposed to have these guys here. What is happening? Well, we'll send the colored cabs out to pick up the colored players. And that's how they got to the Hotel Roosevelt and the Hotel Fontainebleau. Abner Haynes is a friend of mine. Wanted me to write his autobiography. And I said, I'm not a biography writer. I don't do that. I can't do it. I don't do it. I don't have the discipline. You want me to do a 40-second spot on radio? Do that in a shot. Writing a book, an autobiography, not for me. He never did write the autobiography, but he did tell me some of the stories. He and David Grayson, by the way, Abner was the first African-American captain of a football team, pro football team, Dallas Texans in 1961. Anyway, Abner and David Grayson do get cabs and they're able to go to the hotel. And they get to the hotel, check in, they're told name, rank, and serial number. Abner Haynes, running back, Kansas City Chiefs. Don't say anything more. So they check in, they're fine. And they go down the lobby and they're going to go to the elevator to go to their rooms. And it's one of these old hand cranked elevators. The door swings open, somebody moves a gate, somebody is there with a skipper wheel and moves the elevator up and down. He says there's an old white woman who's there, and she looks at Dave Grayson and also Abner and says, hey, monkeys, what are you doing here? The rest is from Abner. They had a woman operating the elevator, and she said, "You monkeys come on in and get to the back." Finally, we had about 10 or 12 guys in my room. We're talking sensibly. We're going to stay together. This was just another test. We had no leverage. We weren't playing for money, but we were playing for progress. Football players took the lead. Well, Elgin Baylor actually took the lead, but that's okay. Places like Atlanta and New Orleans and Miami were death holes. Dave Grayson could get a drink at the bar. Our white teammates in New Orleans were there for us. Guys like him. That is me in 1979. I'm 23 years old. I am interviewing Jack Kemp, who at this point is running for president of the United States. And this is Spark Hill, New York. It's a picture that's bittersweet for me. Yeah, I was 23 interviewing a presidential candidate, but I think if I'm 23 today and trying to do the same thing, there's absolutely no way it would happen because most radio stations have no news departments and you couldn't get close to a presidential candidate like that. But I was invited. It was in Spark Hill, New York at a country club, and I got to interview Jack Kemp. Years later, I showed Jack the picture and he's laughing. He said, "What happened to your hair?" And I said, "What happened to your wig? Powder white." There he is in 2003 with my son down at the Arizona Biltmore, and like I said, his wig turned white. Haynes, again, one of the things we, the NFL, needed was the unity of the white and black players for our league. When the white players, Jack Kemp, Jerry Mays, who was our Kansas City defensive leader, and 4 or 5 other guys heard about what was happening, that there was going to be a boycott, their characters showed, and my teammates were looking after me, and Jack Kemp told them, "We got your back." Ron Mix, who's a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame, played with the Los Angeles San Diego Chargers in the AFL 60 to 69, the 10 years of the league. I've known him since 1997 and called him up one day and said, "Tell me about New Orleans." And he said, "We're aware that New Orleans was hosting a game to demonstrate to the American Football League and National Football League they, New Orleans, could support a football franchise. Last thing we wanted to do was assist them in demonstrating they could support a franchise. A boycott was the only alternative for the players." The mayor of New Orleans was Victor Shiro. And he said the black players should have just rolled with the punches. Yeah, have a gun pulled on you, spit at, cursed at, sure. I couldn't get a cab. The governor, John McKeithen, said there are some clubs down on Bourbon Street that won't even let our district attorney, Jim Garrison, in. Well, maybe because Garrison was peddling Kennedy assassination conspiracy theories at that time. Who knows? The game was played in Houston. New Orleans was on the outside looking in. Eventually, New Orleans would become a political pawn, and the Super Bowl would rise out of the ashes of the New Orleans boycott. Here's Muhammad Ali and me, 1985. Ali identified with Jack Johnson. There was a play on Broadway, 1968, with James Earl Jones, based on the life of Jack Johnson, who had a problem because he kept marrying white women and the people who were running the country didn't like it. Ali said, "Take the issue out of white women and replace it with religion. That's my story." Johnson dated white women and was married 3 times, all to white women. The Mann Act was aimed at him. 1910, the Mann Act. Actually, Congress passed the Mann Act in 1909. President signed it in 1910, William Howard Taft. The law made it illegal to transport any girl or woman over state lines for any immoral purpose. Johnson was arrested, sent to jail for a year. He would flee to Europe after getting out of jail. President Donald Trump pardoned him in 2018. Charlie Chaplin and Chuck Berry were also arrested under the Mann Act. Berry served time in jail. Ali, about Vietnam, conscientious objector. Why should they ask me to put on a uniform, go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple rights, human rights? There's me. I'm at the end of this picture with my microphone pulled back because I'm asking Ali a question at that point. Ali was drafted by the United States military in 1966, called up for induction in 1967. Attended the induction, but refused to answer to his name or take the oath. This led to Ali's arrest and conviction, which in June 1971 was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. The Cleveland Summit. Oh, Walter Beach is back there. He's back in this one. Bill Russell is there. He's back in this one. Lou Alcindor. That was what he was known as in those days. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is there. Jimmy Brown. The mayor of Cleveland, Carl Stokes, is back there. My buddy Walter Flea Roberts is back there. Bobby Mitchell, who's right on top of Muhammad Ali, who was traded to Washington to desegregate the Washington team in 1962. I mean, if I had 5 hours, I wouldn't have enough to do this. But Bobby is there too. And they're testing out Ali. They want to know if he's legit. Jim Brown said, I felt with Ali taking the position he was taking and with him losing the crown without due process, with the government coming in at him with everything they had, that we as a body of prominent athletes could get the truth and stand behind Ali and give him the necessary support. They did. The 11 athletes supported Ali. Irv Cross was a buddy of mine, and about 4 years ago, we were talking, and he said, what you up to? I said, I'm doing a Super Bowl talk. He said, you're going to talk about the AFL guys? I said, yeah. He said, hey, you're going to talk about the quota. I said, you mean the quota that Wally Triplett talked about, the 4 Negroes per team? He said, yeah, that quota. Wally told me about that. Anyway, Irv Cross's rookie year was with the Philadelphia Eagles in 1961. Irv said, 4. He said, give me a minute. Let me think about this. 1961. There was me, and there was Ted Dean, Clarence Peaks, Tim Brown. Yeah, there it is. 4. Tim Brown, Ted Dean, Clarence Peaks, Cross. He said it was perfect. 4 guys, 2 of us in each room. 2 rooms, 2 guys. That was the quota. It was not an official quota. It was a quota. George Preston Marshall is there. An NFL team in the 1950s could have up to 4 Negro players. None of them could be quarterbacks, centers, or middle linebackers. College quarterbacks became defensive backs because they weren't smart enough, receivers or halfbacks. Negroes weren't smart enough to be centers or middle linebackers. And George Preston Marshall's Washington NFL team refused to hire a Negro player in the 1950s. JFK and Marshall. 1962, Cleveland traded Bobby Mitchell to Washington. Straight football deal initiated by the Kennedy administration. Cleveland got the NFL rights to Syracuse running back Ernie Davis. The Washington owner, George Preston Marshall, never hid his racial views, didn't hire any Negro players for his team, but he saw money in this, the model for the new DC Stadium, which is going to get knocked down sometime this year, opened in 1962. That stadium forced Marshall's hand as President John F. Kennedy's Secretary of the Interior. Stuart Udell pushed Marshall and made him obey legislation that prohibited discrimination in federal facilities, just like the 1946 LA Rams. DC Stadium was a federal facility. Udell gave Marshall an ultimatum: hire Negro players or find somewhere else to play. Marshall took the money. Curt Flood is where we leave it. Every year during the baseball owners meetings in December, fans dream about trades that will make their teams better. But they don't realize that players are human beings with wives, kids, businesses, whatever. And I happened to see Curt Flood at a function right after the winter meetings in the late 1980s. And here's the guy who challenged baseball's reserve clause. And asked him a question. And I asked him, okay, I'll just read this to you. This is it. Evan, I'm so pleased you said that. Was Curt Flood's response to a question back in the early 1990s or late 1980s, whenever it was, when asked about the baseball fans' joy of the winter meetings, which is a meat market for baseball teams who trade human beings for others in the hopes that the teams will improve, and yet they forget they trade a human being. Flood challenged baseball's reserve clause after being traded by St. Louis to Philadelphia in December 1969. Guess a week went by, and before you say to yourself, this is not a joke, this is serious, you no longer work here. And I guess about a week, and I talked to Alan Zerman, who is my attorney in St. Louis. He said, Curt, baseball has been doing this to men for 200 years, and you're just part of the machinery. And there's very little you can do about it. You can challenge this if you want to, and it started to germinate then that something illegal had been done to me. Something almost inhumane had been done to me. Kind of snowballed from there. There was Flood with his lawyer, Arthur Goldberg, who used to be, or prior to that, was a Supreme Court justice. I've learned a lot about the law system. Regrets? I had a few. How it operates. Yes, not playing that 1 year in 1970 it is necessary to be damaged in that 1 year, and that would have done it. As I thought about it later, I wish I hadn't played that 1 year in 1971 with the Washington Senators. And the only thing that made me do it was manager Ted Williams. I love him. Supreme Court, I guess they felt the same way that being a baseball player is the best of all worlds, and I ought to sit down someplace and shut up. Supreme Court didn't say that, but they said they were going to leave the decision to someone else. That someone else was Peter Seitz in 1975, who made Dave McNally and Andy Messersmith free agents, but it was Curt Flood that pushed it. When the NBA barred Negroes, it's John McClendon, who I spoke to about 25 years ago, a little more than 25 years ago, about the NBA barring Negroes. 1946, a new basketball league called the Basketball Association of America, with teams mostly in the big Eastern centers like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Washington. The arena owners were looking to fill dates. For some reason only known to them, they put up a color barrier. McClendon, who was coaching for the North Carolina College for Negroes, would alert an NBA team, telling team officials he knew of African-American players who could play in the league. And in 1950, McClendon got the Washington Capitals to take a look at some players who he thought should be in the league, like Earl Lloyd. McClendon forced the issue and brought two players to try out for Washington in 1950, and that brought down the barrier. The Washington Capitals were the first team to have historically black school products on the team. They preceded Boston by a week. There were two guys ahead of the Boston Celtics, Chuck Cooper, Harold Hunter, and Earl Lloyd. Oh, McClendon was also a pioneer, major pioneer, in the very short-lived American Basketball Association, 1960. 62 and 62-63, but they never finished the 62-63 season. He was the coach of the Cleveland Pipers, owned by a 30-year-old guy by the name of George M. Steinbrenner III. His father didn't want him to buy a team. And George, who knew nothing about basketball, interfered and eventually fired McClendon, whose next job was in Malaysia. And I said, Malaysia? Why'd you go to Malaysia? He said, I want to get as far away from George Steinbrenner as absolutely possible. And he did, Malaysia. But he was the first black coach in pro basketball history, although, the New York Rens and the Harlem Globetrotters, who were black enterprises, won the World's Basketball Tournament sponsored by a Chicago newspaper in 1939 and 1940. But in a professional league, McClendon is the first guy. The Mexico City Olympics, the Olympic Project for Human Rights, and the protest. Dr. Tommy Smith originally advocated a boycott of the 1968 Mexico City Olympic Games. His reason? South Africa and Rhodesia, apartheid states, uninvite them from the Olympics. Restore Muhammad Ali's world heavyweight boxing title. Make sure the racist anti-Semite Avery Brundage steps down as president of the IOC, and hire more African-American assistant coaches so they could become coaches. Smith is the winner of the race. John Carlos finishes third, the 100-meter race, and Peter Norman from Australia finishes second. He gets the silver medal. These guys plan to protest. As Smith and John Carlos walk to the podium, they take off their shoes to protest poverty. They wore beads and a scarf to protest lynching. And when the national anthem was played, they lowered their heads in defiance and raised their fists in the Black Power salute. There they are on the podium. Smith, I don't like the idea of people looking as a negative, who was a college professor. There was nothing but a raised fist in the air and a bowed head, acknowledging the American flag, not symbolizing a hatred for it. Carlos, who worked as a guidance counselor at the Palm Springs High School in California, told the Guardian newspaper, had a moral obligation to step up. Morality was a far greater force than the rules and regulations they had. Peter Norman, the white guy, suffered the most. On his left breast, the Australian wore a small badge that read Olympic Project for Human Rights, the organization set up a year previously by Harry Edwards to oppose racism in sports. Norman suggested that Carlos and Smith split the gloves. Norman asked a member of the United States rowing team if he could borrow a badge that read Olympic Project for Human Rights, the project, to oppose racism in sports. Tommy Smith ended up playing with the Cincinnati Bengals, the pre-merger Cincinnati Bengals, for Paul Brown in 1969. Paul Brown hired Bill Willis back in 1946 and Marion Motley. Smith and Carlos played in the AFL-NFL. Smith with the Cincinnati Bengals. Carlos 1 year with Philadelphia. He was injured 1 year with Montreal in the Canadian Football League. They kept their medals. They were never asked to return them to the IOC. Arthur Ashe's fight against apartheid, the tennis player, 1969, applied for a visa to travel to South Africa, compete in the South African Open. Denied the South African visa despite being number one in the U.S. ranking. He continued to apply for visas. He continued to be denied. In the protests, he used this example of discrimination to campaign for the expulsion of the nation from the International Lawn Tennis Federation. He got to play there in 1973, first black pro to play in the national championship. As part of a 31-member delegation, he observed political changes in the country as South Africa began repealing apartheid legislation and moving towards integration. And keeping in tennis, there is Althea Gibson, clearly worthy of an invitation to the U.S. Open. Four-time national champion Alice Marvel weighed in with a letter that appeared in the July 1950 issue of the American Lawn Tennis magazine, noting that a committee member had told her Gibson would be judged on her performance in an invitational tournament to which she wasn't being invited. She said, Alice Marble, Miss Gibson is over a very cunningly wrought barrel. She's not being judged by the yardstick of her ability, but by the fact her pigmentation is somewhat different. She's a fellow tennis player, and as such, deserving of a chance to prove herself. Gibson got a chance, would win the 1957 Wimbledon Championship. Al Campanis, Robinson's friend, Al Campanis, Vice President, Director of Los Angeles Dodgers Player Personnel. It's April 6, 1987. And ABC's Nightline with Ted Koppel commemorated the 40th anniversary of Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier. And they have Campanis on the show. He was a catcher in Montreal when Jackie was there in 1946. The Nightline host, Ted Koppel, spoke to Campanis, and he tried to reel Campanis in. Sometimes when you do an interview and you know a guy said something stupid, you kind of like the guy, you give him some breathing room. Campanis didn't take it. Koppel asked Campanis, why weren't there any black managers, general managers, or owners in baseball? And Campanis said, no, I don't believe it's prejudice. I truly believe that they may not have some of the necessities to be, let's say, a field manager or perhaps a general manager. Koppel's next question, trying to pull him back in, trying to get him to unsay what he said. Do you really believe that? Campanis answered, well, I don't say that all of them, but they certainly are short. How many quarterbacks do you have? How many pitchers do you have that are black? 70-year-old Campanis resigned 2 days later. Campanis never got another job. Campanis spent 2 years writing a book, My Turn at Bat, but his son Jimmy said couldn't interest any publishers. That must have been an amazing story. And it's too bad that they didn't interest any publishers. The legacy. Serena Williams, maybe the greatest tennis player, male or woman, of all time. Hank Aaron broke Babe Ruth's Major League Baseball record, 715th home run, April 1974. Barry Bonds broke Aaron's record. Willie O'Ree broke the hockey color barrier in 1958. But Herb Carnegie never played in the National Hockey League because of his color, and yet he was elected to the Hockey Hall of Fame in 2022. There are the four guys from 1946, Bill Willis and Kenny Washington and Marion Motley and Woody Strode. The Forgotten Four, that's what they were called by the NFL and the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Marion Motley, Woody Strode, Kenny Washington, and Bill Willis reintegrated pro football in 1946. and they were selected to share the Pro Football Hall of Fame's Ralph Hay Pioneer Award during the August 2022 enshrinement. I want to thank everybody for hanging in there. I know this is a bit long, but I am going to open up the floor for you right now. Any questions or comments? Or criticisms? Let me, you could all unmute yourself. Nobody?
I'll just say, throw in my 2 cents. I was a big Elgin Baylor fan when I was a kid. Very, very interesting, Evan. A lot of stuff in there.
I left out a lot of stuff too.
A lot of notes.
Yeah, I left out a lot of stuff, like the two women who could not compete in the 1932 Olympics, Tidy Pickett, I forget the Stokes, Louise Stokes. You can look them up because of Jim Crow, and they competed in the 1936 Olympics. But there's a lot of stuff I also left out.
I had a long conversation with Arthur Ashe, I don't know, about 6 months before he died. And we were talking about lots of stuff. And he talked about how he once talked to the old Mets guy. Was it Vince Coleman?
Vince Coleman? Yeah, Vince Coleman.
Vince Coleman. And there was a quote from Vince Coleman.
Yeah, he didn't know Jackie Robinson.
Yeah, I don't know nothing about no Jackie Robinson. And Arthur said that was the saddest thing that he had ever heard. And it was one of the things that prompted him to do a series of books on Blacks in sports history. And he mentioned how Jackie Joyner Kersey, who was a multiple gold medalist in track and field, who was very aware and was very interested in history, nevertheless, had never heard about this woman named Coachman, who was the first Black woman to win a gold medal in the Olympics. She was in I think the 48 high jump.
Yeah, in London. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's just so much fascinating history out there, and you really hit a lot of hot ones, and I thought that was very interesting. Jackie
was also one of the nicest people I ever met.
Never had the privilege.
Yeah, Jackie was great. She told me, she said,
Jackie Joyner. I thought you were talking about Jackie Robinson.
No, Jackie.
Yes, she was a beauty, and her husband was a fascinating guy as well. Still coaching.
His name was Al Joyner.
No, that was her brother.
I know who you're talking about. But these people have no idea what I'm talking about or you're talking about. So,
I know, that's the trouble, isn't it? We're all old guys.
Yeah. Anybody from the group?
You know, what's interesting, and I'll let everybody speak up that wants to. I mean, what's interesting is that, I was 20, 30, 40, 50 years old before I would learn some of this history, but it's fascinating to stumble across it as you go.
Well, a lot of the names I remember that you went over, but what was that about the baseball gentleman's agreement? Who were those people?
Albert Spalding, Cap Anson, probably some of the people from the New York, I think, was it the New York Mutuals back in those days, and just the people running baseball. But we know that it was Anson and Spalding who led the charge to make sure that, but then again, you got to think of the time. And the Jim Crow laws, not really laws, but Jim Crow was around, Ku Klux Klan was around. And that was America in the 1880s. I mean, Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Harrison, who was president in the mid 1890s, wanted to do something about civil rights, but nothing happened. It was just, that was America at that time. What is amazing is that the Akron Pros had Fritz Pollard as a coach in 1921. That's the amazing thing to me.
Evan, I bet you know about this, but I stumbled onto it when I was doing stuff leading up to the celebration of Jackie Robinson's, would have been in 1997.
Yeah.
I never knew this before. I went to the Hall of Fame and they guided me around a guy named Bud Fowler.
I've heard Bud Fowler, yes.
Yeah, who had played baseball in white teams and white leagues way back in the 1800s.
Yeah.
And I learned recently, I live in Babylon on Long Island, and I learned recently that Bud Fowler apparently had played briefly for a team here, one of the early professional, quote unquote, teams of Black players.
Yeah, Bud Fowler is supposedly the first Black player, except he never played in the National League or the American Association, which were the major leagues at that point.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that stadium in Patterson?
Hinchcliffe. Yeah, it's reopening this year. New Jersey's sinking money into it, and it hosted a lot of things over the years. And they maybe it was the New York Black Yankees that played there, or the New York Cubans that played there. It had a lot of things there. There were concerts in there, football in there, and basically it's for the local high schools in Patterson now. But they're hoping to get something in there with professional baseball. Probably it would have to be a minor league team, and they're opening a Black Sports History Museum there. And in fact, I have to give a talk out in Parsippany on, March 15th. And on the way, I'm going to stop there. There are two reasons I'm going to stop there. One, I do a baseball talk, so I want a picture of the Lou Costello statue of who's on first in Patterson, where he's from. And the other, I want to check out the stadium when I'm there, and also see the falls. There's falls in Patterson. So I'm going to do that all in one day when I go out there, give a talk. Check it out, the Patterson Stadium. There are two. The other one's in Birmingham, Alabama, where Negro Leagues play. Those are the only two left. Any of your other students?
Any guys, pipe up. They're shy.
Oh, okay. They can type something.
I guess.
They can type something in if they want. So
Okay.
anyway, we could probably, John and I could probably be here for the next 5 hours telling you stories.
Yeah, I can tell because you know stuff.
We could probably be here. And
Just
tell
to check
stories.
with you, Evan, so you can email me a copy
Yes.
of this to get to my students that didn't show up.
Yes.
They can save their butts.